Hello, welcome to our first of a three-part webinar series on urban gardens and backyard conservation. My name is Hamity Stage. I'm going to be your host for these webinars. And unfortunately, I do not have a working camera today. So you will be hearing me, but not seeing me. And I don't mind not being seen, but I do admit that it's a little bit unfair that I get to kind of hide back here a little bit. We're gonna just wait a couple more minutes. We still have people trickling in. We're expecting more than I see so far today, and I want to make sure that people don't miss anything that they wanted to catch. So I know that I've been late for things, and I want to be fair for other people to give them a chance to log in and settle into our webinar. To tell you a little bit about who is organizing this, this is brought to you by the Indiana County Conservation District. We help with soil and water conservation on behalf of the County of Indiana. So we do all sorts of things along the lines of working with farmers on nutrient plans, working on, my phone is going up, working on relevant permits to meet clean water standards. So we have just a lot of tools available for anybody who would like to know more about us. You can always come onto our website at iccbca.org. And we are coming, another thing I'd like to let you know is we do have a quarterly newsletter that is going to be coming out, our first edition in January. And you can sign up for that on our website as well. Now, before we get really into the webinar, here's a couple of housekeeping things to let you know about. Especially if this is your first time using GoToWebinar, you do have some options here to make sure your audio is working. That you have my pointer. You can. Sorry, I have to adjust my screen a little bit. That's not what I wanted. What I wanted to point out to you is that we do have a section here just to point out for questions. And if you have the notice of the sidebar, there's this red arrow. So you can hide and collapse that as you need to. And down there, there is this box with the questions. If you have any questions, feel free to enter that as a webinar. You do not have to wait for the end. We'll be answering the questions as we go. There is also a chat feature. So if you have any other questions, you can also ask them in the chat. Let's see. What else? And we do encourage conversation during this webinar. We're going to try to keep it more casual and sort of more of a town hall type style. So we encourage anybody to ask questions if they have. You are still all muted. So if you want to ask a question verbally, feel free to push the button that to raise your hand, and I'll be watching for that. And when I see any hand raised, I'll unmute you and you can ask questions. So we're a couple of minutes in. I think we're going to get started. So does anybody have any questions so far about how to use GoToWebinar? We're all good? Okay, I don't see any questions. So with that, first person who is going to start today is, is Curtis Quantac. Did I say that right?
Yes.
And he is going to be telling us more about conservation in the backyard, and probably go ahead and also tell us a little bit more about what your role is here at the ICCD. Here we are.
Hello, everyone. Nice to see some of the familiar people, and good to see some people that I've not interacted with, so we can definitely increase the people for future webinars we have for various topics of the district. This particular webinar is provided by grant money that came from a grant we did with the community garden in Indiana County, in the town of Indiana. Thanks for joining us as being our first one for this series and a first one for the district as a whole. Thanks for bearing with us. We'll get right on started, and don't be afraid to ask questions. I want a town hall feel. I want to engage and have discussion more than just me lecturing. And sorry, don't mind the dogs. What to talk about today is the activities of preparing your garden in the fall for the winter. And the main thing we want to stop is having bare soil exposed to the weather. Bare soil in your garden over winter is both detrimental to next year's crops, as well as can create runoff of valuable topsoil away from the garden. This can end up increasing sedimentation in storm drains and local streams. So there's only a thin layer of what is soil that is available for plants to grow in. So everybody wants their gardens to produce a lot. That thin layer is what lets that happen. And no matter what you do, if you don't do anything, you will lose topsoil. And that's one of the major pollution concerns in Pennsylvania and the United States in general, is losing topsoil to the streams and to stormwater systems, which is what becomes what's called sedimentation. One of the first things I'd like everybody to do is refrain from fall tilling or disturbing the soil. So that to this time of the year, we're at the end of the growing season, nothing continue growing. We don't want to have bare soil, and we don't want to disturb it further with tillage, because then those soil particles are have a much bigger ability to be taken away by rain. What it is that rain hits the soil with a particular force and dislodges particles, and then over time that the runoff from extreme rains will take that soil away. If you want to avoid tilling, remove this year's crops by hand, mulch up with a lawnmower, and mulching will keep the plant residue on the ground, adding cover to the soil, making a soil armor, and thus protecting it from the rainstorms and snow runoff. So you're protecting your soil and adding nutrients for next year's crops. Is there any questions on that section?
And feel free to raise your hand, and if you can't find where you can type in questions, if you don't have a working mic, let me know in the comments, and I can try to help you find it. Oh, okay.
No,
wait.
they have one.
Do I see a hand? Aha. All right, Casey has a question. I am going to unmute you. If you can unmute at your end.
There I am.
Yay.
I know, right? It works. Okay. So I've don't have like the mulch on my garden now. So what can I do, since I've already taken the plants out and I didn't do that. So is there something I can do now?
Yeah, we're gonna have future slides that talk about other ways of mulching your garden, but in short, to answer your question now, anything that's organic that you may have access to, like leaves.
Okay. Got lots of those. Okay.
Yeah, leaves, grass clippings.
Okay. What about like untreated sawdust? Would that work?
Yes, that will. There is one thing I want to word of caution with anything wood. So any like tree bark mulch, or the tree trimmings that when they do the power lines, anything like that, it's woody.
Okay.
You want to make sure to get as fine a particle size as possible. So obviously sawdust is pretty fine already.
Okay. Good.
But what it is it takes longer for that woody material to break down, to decompose.
Right.
So if you put in like 2 or 3 inch wood chip particles, those are still going to be there, not just next year, but the year after.
Right.
They'll start decaying over time, but you'll still see them. But anything organic that it will provide cover for the soil, will be a barrier against the rain, and it will break down and add organic matter to the soil.
Okay.
The other thing about woody materials is, in a garden sense, it doesn't make as much, but in a farming sense, like if you're talking, something in the 1/2 to 1 acre size for a garden, or like in the farming sense of many acres, woody material becomes a nutrient. It takes up nitrogen, which is a nutrient that your plants need to grow. The decomposition of woody material takes up nitrogen and then releases it when it's finally decomposed. So
Hmm.
if you regularly put sawdust on your garden, you might see a little bit. You might have to add some nitrogen for each individual growing year until that woody material breaks up,
Okay. So don't do it
especially
very
in the beginning.
often, but maybe this year I was okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Like
So
summing it up in my head here. All right. So no, okay, that's good. That's good to know. Good. All right. I'll let you continue.
okay.
Thank you. That was a very good question.
Yeah. So continue on, like we were just talking, use of collected leaves from your garden is good compost and soil, or for your garden is good compost and soil. Grass clippings make good compost and soil cover as well. And a additional way is tarping. One thing, we did this for a little bit at the community garden to do our meadow planting, if anybody's driven past Mac Park and seen it. Tarping, so obviously you need to secure it to the weather so it doesn't blow away on you. But you would take your garden area and tarp it off, and you want a dark colored tarp to withhold the sunlight to do the second portion of this. But it doesn't matter what the color is if all you want to do is protect the soil. So you would protect the soil with that tarp. The rain hits it and runs off, and it's not taking the soil away. The additional benefit to doing this is where a dark tarp comes in handy, is that it will deny sunlight in the early spring to the early germinating weeds and grasses. So that can help you eliminate a round of tillage or herbicide spraying in the spring. So you would leave that tarp on until it is time to plant, and then pull it off, and you'll have your bare soil ready for planting. It's also a good way to put that, it takes a while for the vegetation kill to happen using a tarp. So putting them on now when there's nothing active is the best way to get that end result of a vegetation kill. Anybody have any questions on tarping or the other items?
Oh, I was going to add a little bit to that, if you don't mind.
Oh, go right ahead. Go right ahead.
Yeah, there's something similar to tarping is instead of using a tarp, you can also use really thick corrugated cardboard and flatten that out. And as long as you have it weighed down with like a lot of mulch on top of it, or weigh it the same way down you have with the tarp, it can have something similar. So if you go to like one of the appliance stores and maybe they have just tons of cardboard that they're needing to get rid of, you can use that. The one thing to make sure is that it's a brown cardboard, not something that has that sort of white paper that they put over it. And that it says that it's printed on with soy-based ink, because the soy-based inks are compostable, but not necessarily some of the other inks that might have some sort of metallics in it. You don't really want those in your garden, but especially if you get a plain non-printed cardboard, that can work too. And the Pennsylvania State Extension actually has like a website and a little video that talks about how to do this smothering technique in order to prepare your garden bed. Okay. Any other questions? Oh, I see a hand is up. Let me try to find that hand. Cindy has a question. I am unmute. Okay. Let's see. Can you unmute, Cindy? Okay. Try
Yes,
unmuting.
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, Cindy.
Okay,
Hi, Cindy.
so my question is, so I have tarps over my garden, and what about any kind of fertilizer in the spring? Is there, because your I didn't till, obviously, and I'm killing all the weeds, and they'll go back into the soil. But is there a need for some additional fertilizer or anything in the spring before you plant?
I would say it's not going to be necessary because of the tarping, using the tarping method. We are going to have a future webinar that before the spring where we're going to talk about doing things in the spring, and one of the big things about that is going to be explaining how to get soil tests done via Penn State Extension and some other avenues. Doing a simple soil test can save you, it can give you the ability to better medicate your plants, not medicate, but address your plants' needs based on the nutrients available in your soil before the growing season starts. That way you can adjust how much fertilizer you need at the beginning or in the middle stages of growth. And you can also tailor that if like your garden's mainly tomatoes, you can put specifically on the soil test that you are going to grow good tomatoes, and they'll give you a fertilizer recommendation based on tomatoes and based on what your soil is. That'll definitely be a future topic in a future webinar. And as far as I know, the tarping is not going to change the soil by itself to increase or decrease fertilizer need. Hopefully that answered your question, Cindy. Anybody else?
Thank you.
We'll move on. So we're going to get to this is my preferred way, and I think the nicer looking way and the way, the more natural way is covering the garden, is planting a cover crop or overwinter crop. Planting things such as winter wheat, grain, rye, turnips and radishes will protect the soil from runoff and provide winter-long green instead of the bare soil brown. Radish and turnips also provide an additional benefit because of their tubing nature to go down into the soil and break soil compactions. All these crops can be mowed, killed with herbicide, or tilled in the spring to add to the organic matter of the soil and fuel next year's crops. A lot of these winter crops are not necessarily going to provide anything edible for you. There's definitely differences, and we'll go into further in the next few slides, but there's a difference between it was referred, the radishes and turnips you can buy at the grocery store, and what in conservation we refer to as a forage turnip and radish. They make species of radish and turnip that are bred to produce a larger root and do better for the soil and give you the benefit to the soil, but not actually eat them. So these things can be planted after everything else in the garden. And by the time peppers and tomatoes and all the other garden plants are done for the season, all of these types of plants can be planted in the fall, and they will either have their entire growing season in the last days of the fall, or they have a period where they go dormant during the winter and grow again in the spring, which is something like winter wheat and grain rye do. Farmers on hundreds of acres use this same principle, and it's just a manner of bringing it down to the small scale, the backyard scale. The other thing was overwinter crops like garlic can provide cover and give another food produce from your garden. So garlic gets planted in late fall, goes into the dormancy period, and continues growing as soon as the soil hits a relatively good enough temperature relative to other garden crops that can't be planted yet because it's too cold. Garlic will be growing. Garlic can be harvested before you go and plant your other crops as well. And it's also, has a small tubing effect of its roots going down in the soil. All of these work out better because you are creating more organic matter by keeping all that plant material on the garden as you go through season to season. And then you get to look out in the fall and in the winter and look, there's these nice rows or a nice scattering of a green plant that has grown and will stay green the whole season. We'll look to the next slide. So this is a picture I was trying to show you tillage radish versus the radishes and turnips we eat. It's a profile. It shows you how the roots go down. So as that root goes vertically, it grows through various layers of compaction and various soil stratification layers, and that enables a better nutrient flow and creates more soil as it does that. Horizontally, the plant, that tube grows out and creates more finer roots and creates gaps in the soil for more water. So an additional benefit to using these turnips and radishes is, in a year like we just had where we didn't have enough rain, these types of plants will create gaps in the soil that lead to hold more water, thus letting you not have to irrigate as much, or have, you'll have more production compared to your neighbor that didn't use it in a dry year. Covered a little bit there, so we'll stop and see if anybody has some questions on the various cover crops. I see Kay has her hand up.
All right, let me unmute Kay. All right, Kay, you can unmute now. All right, let's try that again. Okay, Kay, go ahead and unmute. Kay, do you still have a question?
Sorry, it took me a while to figure out what was what.
Yeah.
Curtis, could you talk a bit about when you can plant these different cover crops? Because my understanding is that some of them, like the forager radish, that there's a time period beyond which you're really not going to, it's not going to work to plant them, that it's too late in the season to do that.
Yeah, so right now we're too late in the season for any of these to be planted. And obviously this is for your information in the future sense. If you want to plant tillage and if you want to plant radishes and turnips for consumption, regular garden varieties, you want to get those in, and that's a very limited time frame in August to get a fall crop. That way there's enough time for them to produce their food, the food tuber, and they also susceptible to high heat. So they don't want to germinate. You don't want to germinate, and they won't grow right if you plant them in the middle of July, for instance. A lot of the things like grain rye, wheat, things that are not going to produce a food and just be a cover, they can be planted as late as the week before Thanksgiving. You can start planting them at the beginning of September, and then you can plant from the beginning of September to into November. You won't get as much growth out of them pre-dormancy when you plant them later in the fall season. But any cover is better than no cover. And then anything that does get started will come back in the spring. And as far as just covering a garden in small areas, that cover is going to be worth it, because it's not going to matter if you go into winter with a 13-inch tall rye or 2-inch tall rye. It gets you enough, and something's better than nothing in this situation, definitely. Garlic also has a small time frame, and definitely want to check online sources or Penn State Extension for the proper planting dates for garlic in order to get a good garlic crop.
Curtis, what about the the tillage radishes and whatnot?
So tillage radish and turnips are fine. If you want to get the absolute most benefit, you definitely want to plant in August to give them the most amount of growing time. But you could plant them in September, and you're just not going to get as much growth. You're not going to get as much growth below the soil and not as much growth above the soil. But it's one of those things, when it comes to just providing cover, something is better than nothing in all instances.
Just one more comment about the garlic, planting garlic. It depends on the year, obviously, how late you can plant it, but people who know a lot more about garlic planting than I do would also recommend when you plant garlic in the fall that you also put a layer of straw or shredded leaves, something to mulch it so that it doesn't, when there's freezing and thawing over the winter, it doesn't pop out of the ground. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're using garlic, but it's a great thing, as you're saying, for breaking up the soil and also having a wonderful crop in the summer.
Yeah, and definitely mulching is always preferred. Like you can tie in multiple ideas that we've discussed already. You know, you can plant, you don't want to plant you can plant your rye if you just want to plant some rows of it, or if you just want to plant some rows of tillage radish, mulching around it. You can, you know, there is room to create your own little cover plan and to make it what you want, how much effort you want to put in it. Like if you go through and say, I don't want to plant this entire, 1,000 square foot thing with radishes, but I'll go put a few rows in here and there and crisscross them and I'll mulch the rest of it. That's great too. All that organic matter is always good. All that cover is always good. Moving the next slide shows some pictures. So this is to emphasize the point that there's a difference between forage conservation plantings and what you wanted to eat. The picture on the right is a woman holding I believe is a variety called T2 Raptor turnip. They will grow up to 3 feet deep and 6 inches around. They do serious physical work to the soil profile. That is not an edible turnip. Neither is the middle picture, and the left picture shows you, even though they look like they're popping out of the ground, they can see in detail that dirt being pushed out, and then that plant will decay over winter and over spring. That's what one thing turnips and radishes do is that the actual root will decay and get smaller, so it pushes that out and then leaves a gaps. All the roots and that bulb will leave a gap as it decays over the winter season. Another point of concern is if a stream runs through or next to your property, it is best to let the vegetation of all kinds grow along it as both a buffer to runoff and to stabilize the stream bank. At the very least, stop mowing embankments partway through the growing season to allow enough growth to last through winter so that high water events do not wash away the banks of the stream. Do not dump debris such as tree limbs, grass clippings onto stream banks because they suppress vegetation growth and can be dislodged during high water events and cause problems downstream. Obviously, it's way better to put those on your garden, and it can save you fertilizer in the future, having all that organic matter in your garden. But the main takeaway point from this section is that we see in our field and in our work, we see a lot of people that mow and weed eat stream banks to the very edge because they want that pristine look. But what happens is that is not the way nature keeps a stream in place. So you end up losing usable property to each high water event. Takes a little by little, takes a little bit of your property and sends it downstream to the neighbor. Thus, you lose the use of it, and that's not good for the environment either. You end up having a situation where you're going to end up having something that looks worse than if you had let some of that vegetation grow. So at the very least, let some of it grow as we get to the end of a growing season in the fall. That way you can it will be, if it's weeds, if it's a briar patch, that's what you're worried about happening. If you do it in the fall, it doesn't have enough time to grow and make seeds. It has enough time to grow and create a barrier against high water events. And it will die over the winter, and you can go back to it in the spring to keep it clean. This was going to tie in, we're going to ask questions right here, and we'll talk about buffers and stream banks with Bob here a little bit after I take questions, and we'll move into showing why it's so important to keep that stream corridor healthy there. So is there any comments or questions?
We have some poll questions we were gonna work into this presentation today. So If nobody has any questions, maybe now would be a good time to get our poll questions in.
Yeah, if we just do that, then yeah.
All right, so our first question we have is, do you already have a garden? All right, we have about half of you have voted so far. We'll give another couple of seconds for everybody else to jump in. I know for me, I don't have a garden myself, but it's one of those things where I come and I watch things like this so that when I get to a place where I can have my own garden, I'll already be equipped with the knowledge I need in order to set one up. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And it looks like those of us who have, everybody who answered said that yes, they do have a garden. So, all right, so that means I'm not going to answer my next question then, because the next one's going to be, are you planning on putting one in? So that's all the poll questions I have for today. So does anybody else have any more questions about, I don't see any raised hands about what we've talked about so far. So I think what we'll do then is we will go ahead and switch over to Bob. He is, and he is going to talk to us about riparian strips.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Bob Sabo. For those of you that I don't know, I am the watershed specialist at the Indiana County Conservation District. And today we're going to talk about riparian buffers a little bit. Hold on one second, I lost my PowerPoint.
Yeah, I was going to say I changed. Oh, okay. Okay, we need to change it back to, we need to change the presenter back to Curtis. That's why. Okay.
There we go. Everybody see the PowerPoint again?
I can't answer.
Okay.
Well,
I can see it. Yeah,
yep.
it should be showing now. Yeah.
Good enough. Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about the benefits of forested riparian buffer zones. So forested riparian buffer zones are the strips of trees, shrubs, and other vegetation that grow along waterways, and they help to protect the stream health by filtering off runoff, providing shade and habitat for aquatic life, and stabilizing the soil on your stream bank. Go to the next slide, Curtis. So just to illustrate this a little more, in a study done by the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, they did a study of 16 streams in eastern Pennsylvania. And they found that the forested streams were far more efficient at removing key pollutants from water than the non-forested streams. And in the case of nitrogen pollution, they were 200 to 800 times more nitrogen reached the stream in the non-forested segments than reached the stream in the forested segments. And that is obviously very significant. And there are many species of native trees and shrubs that you can use in these forested riparian buffers, including species that bear fruits and nuts that you can harvest for your own consumption or even to sell if it's at a large enough scale. And there are grants available to pay for these forested riparian buffers. And if any of you are interested in having one planted at your property or know of a good place to have one planted, feel free to contact us at the Indiana County Conservation District. We'd be glad to get that going for you. Just sort of in general, the strips are usually about 35 to 50 feet off of the stream bank on either side is how wide you'd want them to be. And so you plant them, each tree is about 15 feet spaced apart. Any of the deciduous trees get a nice tree tube to keep it safe from browsing deer and other plant life while it's young. Whereas evergreens and shrubs don't get a tube, it's not needed. They're not quite as appealing to the deer. But again, you know, there are grants available to pay for it. All of these supplies would be provided, and they end up looking really nice. And just this fall, we are in the process of planting 3 riparian buffer zone projects around the county for a total of about 5 acres of land. So, yeah. Again, if anyone is interested or has a place that is, you know, that would be applicable for this, please reach out to us. We'd love to help out.
Yeah, and I just want to add in that, you know, you don't have to go full blown to start having the benefit. You can add in a few trees and a few shrubs if you don't have a very large area to begin with. That anything is better than nothing.
Exactly.
So that brings us to the end of the what we have for slide wise, but definitely if anybody wants to talk or add any questions in, especially about the, you know, what we just talked about with the riparian buffers of various sizes, to speak up, I definitely want to engage me. We got Kay, I see.
If you wanted to plant just a few trees on your own property to soak up water, 2 questions. What would be some of the trees you would recommend, or ways or places to look to get some lists of the kinds of trees that would be good for particular environments, number 1. And number 2, if you just, again, instead of it being a riparian buffer project, you're trying on your own property to protect some trees from deer, which are all over this county on places they didn't used to be. But what are some of the where can you get tree tubes, for example, or what if a tree is bigger than that? What are some options for protecting trees that are getting damaged by deer? So I've asked a bunch of questions all at once, but you know, those are issues a lot of us are dealing with that don't have a lot of land, but things are happening on our property.
Sure. So the first question, I guess, with the tree tubes, I know Forestry Supply would be a good place that you can order them from. And you just go to their website online, forestrysupply.com. And they have a variety of different tree tubes that you can order there. As far as if they're too big to fit in a tree tube, obviously I would say just a small ring of fence around the tree would probably be a good way to keep the deer out. And really, when talking about the tree tubes, they usually say once the tree is wide enough to sort of break out of the tube, then it's big enough that the deer aren't going to harm it necessarily by browsing on it at that point. So you might be safe if it's wider than the tree tube is from the deer anyhow. As far as species, I mean, there are a lot of good species, and there are lists available, and anyone can obviously reach out to us at our emails or phone numbers listed here. to provide a comprehensive list, but things such as swamp white oak are very good, river birch, black willows. There were silky dogwoods for some lower growing, more shrub-like plants. There really are a wide variety of species.
Okay, I have a question that popped up here in a question box, and it says, what if you live along a stream, but the neighbors may not want to plant them along their portion of the stream front? Is there still funding available?
Yeah, it can be really as small as your property. We can do a project. So even if your neighbors aren't interested, you know, we can just do your small little spot. And as Curtis was saying, anything is better than nothing, and that also includes sort of horizontally along the stream. So even you know, just a small section is still going to help reduce the runoff there. It's going to provide the habitat for the aquatic organisms, and the shade for the stream, and help stabilize the stream bank. And you know, really with any luck, if everything goes well on that small planting, and it after a few years it starts to look really nice, then maybe your neighbors would be interested.
I know, like I said, if you do have enough linear feet that you own of the stream and you're having a serious stream bank erosion problem, there is other funding for doing other projects and other structures. But that does require a little bit of, yeah, you have to have enough linear feet of stream bank to do those on.
One of the things we kind of come across in conservation is that there are a lot of people out there who are waiting for they're like, well, what's the point of me doing it if none of my neighbors are doing it? And really what kind of happens is, like, once one person in the neighborhood or in a community starts doing that first conservation measure, it becomes way more likely that other people in that area are going to do it too. So just by having one person sort of spearhead the effort, all of a sudden it becomes much more likely for the second person. Once the second person starts doing it, it's much more likely there's going to be a third or a fourth. So sometimes with these conservation efforts, really the hardest thing for us to do is just to get the first person to voluntarily install whatever it is, whether it's a riparian strip or a water garden or a rain garden or rain barrels or that sort of thing.
Yeah, definitely don't be afraid to be the pioneer, to use the word that they use when it comes to adopting new ideas. If you be the pioneer in your neighborhood, and people will see you can plant these species of trees and do these things with your garden. You know, even though you might only own 100 feet of stream bank, and then you have 15 neighbors with their 100 feet of stream bank, if you can manage yours to look aesthetically and both environmentally be better, and people will take notice.
And one of the things about and Barb has another question, is can we be involved in the selection of plant material that works in the area?
Yeah. Like I was saying, you know, there are a wide variety of species that are considered acceptable, and mainly, you know, we're looking for native species. They would provide the most benefit for the local wildlife, on top of the runoff and soil stabilization properties. But within that list, yeah, we encourage any of the property owners involved to, you know, if there's specific species that you'd like to see more of, if there's certain species that you'd rather not have on your property, yeah, we definitely would want to work with you and try to give you something that you're going to be happy with, and something that you're going to want to look at and see. I mean, you're the one that's going to have to look at it every day.
And she also put great thanks for the answer for the last question. So I had a question and I can't remember what it was that I was going to ask. Something else to let everyone know is that our annual tree sale is going to be coming up soon. So things are in the works as far as planning. So I just wanted to give you the heads up that if you don't have a space that's large enough to make sense to try to install riparians, but you do want trees, they are at a very affordable rate, looking at the prices that I was seeing for how many trees you're going to be getting. And you can also buy tree cubes to go along with them.
Yeah, and one of the bundles, what I believe it's called the wet feet bundle or something, Curtis.
Yeah.
You remember? Yeah, and that's specifically for areas that are wet and by the stream and flood occasionally. And as Timothy was saying, these bundles all do come with everything you would need, including the tubes and a mat and everything else.
And then also the proceeds from that particular sale goes to our scholarship fund for the Envirothon winners.
Yeah, that's a nice scholarship. For the senior Envirothon members, they get $500 scholarship for each of the winners. So it's a really $500 can be a lot when you're starting college. We have another question from Harry. He asks, how far back from the stream should we develop a stream buffer? 25 feet, 50 feet, 100 feet, 150 feet? What are your recommendations?
So I don't know that there's really an outer limit to it. As long as we're starting, as long as we're starting at the stream bank, you know, I don't think the state would have any issues with it extending back too far. So
that does change the species that
yeah,
you want to plant.
You know, we do the plantings normally in zones. So the first 15 feet away from the stream is zone 1, and those are species that definitely like to be wet and are going to give you the most benefit in stabilizing the bank. And as you move further away into zones 2 and 3, you start to get more sort of upland species. So obviously, if you're 150 feet away, you're not going to want to plant those real wet stream bank loving species. Another thing is also, it's not even necessarily just around streams. These riparian buffers could also be planted around wetland areas. So if you have any area that's swampy, it could potentially also be planted around those.
Yeah, definitely for people with small properties that have that wet spot, either because it's low or a spring collects there. Instead of just continuously mowing around it and leaving ruts from your lawnmower in it, a few strategic plantings can give you a much better aesthetic, give them much better for the environment, and take care of a problem and turn it into something nice.
Mm-hmm.
And also, just to add to that, what I was just reading a study recently about salamanders. They're dependent on these temporary wetlands, these sort of vernal pools where they're breeding. And one of the biggest things that you can have as many vernal pools there as you want, but they do much better if there are forested plantings, some sort of tree plantings around those vernal pools. So one of the ways to prevent these salamanders from getting on the endangered species list, to keep them, it's much cheaper to prevent being listed than it is to correct the species, than to correct the population that has to be listed. So preventing population loss is much cheaper than dealing with after a population loss. So the more we can do to preserve these vernal pools and the forested areas around them, the better it'll be for these salamanders.
I think it's a good question from Kay.
Yeah, can we send you information about the tree sale? Yes, it's going to be on our quarterly newsletter when that comes out in the beginning of January. It will be announced on our Facebook. And if you want us to send you directly an email, go ahead and either email us or Bob and Curtis's, email Bob, are you running the tree sale?
It's sort of a joint project. So you can email either one of us.
All right. And you can email directly to them and they will send you the information as it comes out. All right. This has been some good conversation so far. Anybody else have questions? Feel free to put your hands up.
I see something in chat box a question. Can you plant turnips, radishes in between rows of your garden throughout the growing season to help with water infiltration throughout the year?
You can, to a certain extent. Carrots, or I'm sorry, the radishes in them do have a certain point where it becomes too hot or too dry, both in soil temperature hot and air temperature hot, that they won't grow. They're not a midsummer crop. Now, if you plant them at the right time and they grow and those plants are there, the plant will still be there. It's just not going to do any continuous growing through that summer period, and most likely it's going to eventually die or be stunted to a point that it can't grow in the next season. A lot of those varieties have only a 60-day growth cycle, so you don't need much time for them to reach maturity. And then also, if planted at the right time and left at the right in for long enough, they will bolt, like lettuce and other root crop, or lettuce and other crops do. So you'll end up having a plant with the tall central spike and seeds going everywhere. Mulching is going to be is great for in between the rows in general for both weed control, moisture retention, and is definitely going to be some of the things we talk about in our spring garden conservation webinar. Hopefully that answered your question.
Oh. Harry commented, good, a forest shall be had. To kind of go back to the deer damage, some of the things we have to think about when we're talking about managing deer and deer-related issues is what specifically the damage is that you're dealing with. So if it's over browsing, that's different from having to deal with a buck that's going a little too hard on your antler rubs in your trees. So so kind of when you're thinking about I need to protect my tree from deer, think if it's a buck rub, then you might have to think about different fencing offers than if it's just the deer are nibbling on your tree as high as you can reach. One thing to think about is once a tree does get to a large enough size, it can handle being hit by some deer nibbling. Really, with the tree tooth, we want to make sure that the tree gets tall enough that the deer can't nibble on the top of the tree, because that's what's going to stunt the tree and keep it from getting as full height as it can go. So I just wanted to clarify about deers. When we think about deer, excluding deer, we have to think about why we're excluding them. Oh, no, that's the same one. Let's see if I have any new questions that have come up. Okay, answered that question, answered those questions. Does anybody else have any other questions or comments? Feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask on mic, or you can type in the question box.
And then if anybody wants us to email us questions, we answer everything. We'll look it up. No matter what, if we don't know the answer, we'll look it up or get you to the person that will have that answer. Because there's plenty of other resources for all these topics, both within the county and regionally.
Hey, has a question.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, we hear you.
And that is one thing that I've been noticing in the last weeks at the community garden is a lot of damage in some particular raised beds near where the gas well is, that from voles. V is in vase, OLES. A lot of little trails, but they're in the raised beds, which means, anyway, any thoughts on how to help deal with those? There are more and more little trails through there, and they weren't there in the summer, but they have come in the later fall.
Are they disturbing plants that you want to keep, or are they doing this in barren
They-
beds.
They are disturbing cover crops, actually, that we planted, winter wheat that we were planting to keep it not bare ground.
As long as they like, as long as they're not removing the plant cover itself, like yes, they may be just damaging the plant, some plants. As long as they don't remove the plant cover, it's just another part of nature's way of stop. Those little animals are just bigger versions of the microorganisms that move soil nutrients around, move the soil around, and change it into what's usable for plants. If you have too many of them, or in the garden sense, you don't want them around for, to carry fleas or something like that. Anything short of, there's the same humane and there's humane responses, but humane killing and humane relocation. It's using little traps, and those things are pretty much the same way you would try to get some, if you had mice in your shed, is going to be the same reaction.
Yeah, the one thing with
Are
bulbs,
they going to be a big problem? I mean, my concern is not so much with the cover crop, but when the weather gets warmer, we use those beds to grow up the fence, to grow up, starting in the spring, sugar snap peas and so on. If I don't do anything now in terms of trapping, am I going to have a big problem when in March I'm trying to put seeds in there?
I would say that they're just looking for a warm place, and that once you start regular activity, they'll go find a new home, especially once it's warm and they can go elsewhere and find other food sources that are more plentiful.
yeah, I think for those particular beds, you might want to do another something as far as like when you do the kill for the grass. I don't know what technique you do, but you might want to do like a tarp or a really thick mulch cover and not just leave it to the grass by itself. And that's going to discourage the voles a little bit more, because they like that shelter that's provided by the grass when they're above ground. In addition to all of that nice space they have in the bed below ground. So that's kind of my guess. That's what I understand about vole behavior so far. So you might have to look more into your kill-off method before you put the sweet peas in, of just like really putting a thick layer of something on top of it, making sure that's a good kill, and that there's a really good thick layer on top of that soil, and then you will, especially if you can do a cover that you can do a drill through, like drill the soil, just like open it up just a little bit, just enough to get that sweet pea seed down in there. That'll help too.
Thanks.
Okay, you're welcome. Okay. Any other questions, comments? Commitments to plant more trees? All right, Molly Saber, Molly has left, but she did say that she has another meeting, and she said thank you for the great presentation. Thank you, Molly, for coming.
Well, thank you everybody for attending. Call us or email us with any questions or anything else you want to talk about, and to say we'll get our other spring webinar launching in the spring to get you ready for what to do going into the next growing season.
Yep.
Yeah. We're probably going to have that date confirmed and sent out within the next week or two for our, what I believe sometime in early mid-February is when we're going to have our second, and our third has been scheduled for March. If you'd like to follow our activities, like I mentioned before, you can follow us on Facebook. You can sign up for our quarterly newsletter, and if we get busy enough, it might become a monthly newsletter, but for now it's quarterly. And like Curtis said, feel free to email either Bob or Curtis at the ICC-DPA, and thank you for coming. I think this has gone really well, and I really appreciate everybody's excellent questions and conversation, and I hope to see you at our next webinar.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye.
Bye.